is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Frank talks in Moscow over the war in Ukraine as the United Nations Secretary-General calls for a ceasefire as soon as possible.
Defence ministers meet in Germany, warning of critical weeks ahead for the conflict in Ukraine. In a major U-turn, Germany will now supply Ukraine with tanks.
Beijing launches mass coronavirus testing for nearly all its residents as efforts are ramped up to avoid a strict lockdown like Shanghai.
And a clearer picture emerges of the challenges ahead for France's President Macron. He has a fight on his hands in parliamentary elections next.
The United Nations' most senior diplomat is in Moscow for talks over the conflict in Ukraine. Speaking after a meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister, Antonio Guterres described negotiations as frank, adding that the sooner peace is established in Ukraine, the better. Guterres also stressed the need for humanitarian corridors out of the besieged city of Mariupol.
The UN chief says his trip to Moscow was for humanitarian purposes aimed at preserving human life in the areas worst hit by Russian bombing. He's proposed Ukraine, Russia and the United Nations join forces to coordinate the response, but it is not clear if that idea will be embraced by Russia, which says it's already providing safe corridors and aid to the country. Our correspondent Stuart Smith reports now from Moscow.
Antonio Guterres said he came as a messenger of peace to save lives and decrease suffering. Both the Secretary-General and Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, seemed to feel the meeting went well, despite fundamental objections about how to characterize what Russia is doing in Ukraine and whether or not it violates the UN Charter. Sergei Lavrov took the opportunity to present why he thought the so-called special military operation was justified and insisted it was only due to US pressure that countries had either abstained or voted with Washington to declare Russia's actions illegal. He suggested again that this fight was much bigger than the conflict in Ukraine, that the world faced a choice, either one force, the US, imposing its rules on the entire world, or countries living freely under UN rules. The Secretary-General suggested it was Russia that wasn't following the rules, that a quick end to the violence was necessary, and that diplomacy was the way to get there. The Foreign Minister agreed on the need for diplomacy, but said it was Kiev jeopardizing the process, having now sat on Russia's latest proposal for peace for a week and a half without response. Both seemed pleased there had been a strong conversation about what a multilateral world should look like, but it wasn't obvious that any quick or new means to save lives and decrease suffering had been found. The Secretary-General heads to Kiev on Thursday. Stuart Smith, CGTN, Moscow.
So how will the talks in Moscow be viewed by Ukraine's president and his government? Well, let's talk now to Associated Press reporter John Gambrell, who's in Lviv. John, President Zelensky had already said that Guterres should have come to Kyiv before going to Moscow. What has Ukraine said it wants to see from the UN and the international community?
One important thing that the Ukrainian officials have brought up about the UN recently was that they hoped that the UN and perhaps the International Committee of the Red Cross could join together to form a humanitarian corridor that would allow the hundreds of people who are still inside of the steel mill in Mariupol, where the Russians are still besieging, to be able to leave safely. Now, the Russians a couple days ago said that they had agreed to cease fire there, but the Ukrainians said they didn't believe them and accused the Russians of previously backing away from other terms like this. So they'd hoped the international community would be able to come through and do this. One thing to keep in mind, though, that Zelensky's probably thinking as well, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had traveled to both Moscow and Kiev in 2014 after Russia annexed and seized Crimea, and Ban Ki-moon's trip was unsuccessful.
Meanwhile, John, defence ministers are meeting in Germany with the United States describing the coming weeks as critical. What are we seeing on the ground now in Ukraine?
There's been intense bombardment and fighting in the eastern part of Ukraine. We've seen people killed as well as people wounded in shelling and missile attacks. We've also seen an attack targeting a bridge near Odessa that was key to transportation and movement in that area. We've also seen Russia target railroad infrastructure in the last few days. Railroads are really important. They help move both people and war material around this country. And if the railroads are disrupted, that really limits the ability to move goods and people around, as air travel is non-existent right now given the war, and as roads are just filled with police and military checkpoints across the country.
John Gambrell in Lviv, thank you.
Moldova has held an emergency meeting of its Supreme Security Council after 2 grenade attacks in its pro-Russian breakaway region of Transnistria. The country's president says the blasts, which destroyed a radio mast, were an attempt to destabilize Moldova. Well, let's talk to Stefan Wolf, Professor of International Security based in Frankfurt in Germany. Professor, welcome. Your analysis, your thoughts on this attack and who might be responsible?
Thank you. At the moment, I think the most likely explanation is that this was a false flag operation carried out by Russian forces or Russian agents stationed in this breakaway territory of Transnistria, mostly aimed at destabilizing both Transnistria but also Moldova itself.
Russia has, I think, more than 1,000 troops stationed in Transnistria. I wonder how has the invasion of Ukraine changed how Moldovans view that situation?
I think Moldovans, both in Moldova and in Transnistria, are very worried about this. There have been reports for quite some time now that Transnistria and Moldova might be another target for President Putin in his attempt to reconstitute Russia as a great power and secure its own sphere of influence in parts of the former Soviet Union. But the appetite on both sides of the river Dnistru that separates Transnistria and Moldova to be dragged into this was very limited. So even on the Transnistrian side, which is slightly more pro-Russian territory of Moldova, nobody really wants to fight in Russia's war in Ukraine. So I think from that perspective, what we see right now is deliberate attempts by Russia to destabilize the region and then have a pretext potentially to invade there as well as they did in Ukraine.
Is a full capture of Ukraine's Black Sea coast as far as Moldova by Russian forces a realistic possibility?
Not in the near future. I mean, as you reported just now, Russia is mostly concentrating its efforts on the eastern Donbas region, has been doing so for several weeks now without making any significant territorial gains. That, I think, indicates that right now Russia does not have either the personnel or the hardware to push Ukrainian forces back. It has also now significantly depleted naval capabilities in the Black Sea, where it has lost its flagship cruiser Moskva just about a week ago. So I think from that perspective, the Russian war aims might still stand to capture all of the Black Sea coast. But in the foreseeable future, I do not think that Russia has the capabilities to actually accomplish this.
So Moldova's Supreme Security Council has now met for this emergency meeting. What might the next steps be for Moldova's government?
I think Moldova's government needs to take control of the information space, needs to assure its own population and people in Transnistria that it does not have any intention to contribute to any destabilization. And I think it's also important for the West now to step up and make it very clear to President Putin that there would be a similarly strong reaction, as has been in the case of Ukraine, if he were to try anything in relation to Transnistria or Moldova.
Professor, thank you very much indeed. Professor Stefan Wolf, a Professor of International Security based in Frankfurt in Germany.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Will Musk mean less censorship? Talking Twitter next from New York.
The British public not only need to know, but they want to know more about China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
East meets West. We're now at a time when we need the icebreaker spirit.
My first impression when I came to China is I noticed the similarities more than the differences.
It's about understanding each other's culture.
We look at the things that bring our nations together.
My dad is Chinese, my mom is English. I grew up in London, but I went to China to work at age 25.
Whenever I've gone to China, it's just been amazingly welcoming.
The music is beautiful language and bringing all the people together.
I'm exploring, I'm experimenting, I'm trying something new, all in the hopes to build a bridge. And I think we definitely need more people doing that.
It was only when I got to know my Chinese father in my 40s that I really got to know the other half of myself.
I hope we make it another 50 years, another 500 years.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and to open up our world, on TV and online on CGTN.
I hope that you will all become icebreakers and bridge builders.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Britain and the European Commission have warned that Twitter must be responsible following its purchase by Elon Musk. The billionaire has reached an agreement to buy the platform for $44 billion. With a pledge to reduce censorship, many people are concerned that less moderation could lead to a rise in hate speech. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. John, so what is America saying about this?
Well, I told you yesterday on the program that this was going to happen, didn't I? It was either going to happen towards the end of the week or it was going to happen on Monday. And in the end, it came with about an hour's trading left here at the New York Stock Exchange. I'm surprised they didn't wait until after the closing bell, but they didn't. Anyway, so now we have a story that's really nicely split down the middle into two. We have the business story, which I think we have to celebrate. I think we have to do that. And then there's the political story, which, of course, is very divisive. So let's begin with the business story. I mean, the man is a genius. It's as simple as that. I don't think there's anybody else in the world that could have pulled this off. And this is a huge deal that he has pulled off. He has bought pretty much the only global mass media company that he probably could buy outright, because all the others are attached to other media corporations, and it's all complicated. But Twitter could be bought like that, and he's gone and done it. Now, what is interesting to me is that the world's richest man still needed the help of the banks. That's the extraordinary thing. He turned to Morgan Stanley, and then I understand he also turned to Bank of America as well, which has Merrill Lynch as its investment banking arm. And why would the banks help him out? Well, if you think about it, they've now got an inside track into Tesla as well. If you think about it, he phoned up and said, I want to borrow some money, and they said, Elon Musk is on the phone. We can get access to Tesla if we do this. So they lent him some money, and they're hoping that they will now have the inside track on SpaceX and Tesla as well. There's another thing that you don't know, which I do know, and that is that the banks prepared a report for the Twitter board. And that report said that Elon Musk's offer of $54.20 per share was very fair, and that the banks thought that it would take Twitter a long time, if ever, to get to that level of $54.20. And the other thing is we are expecting Twitter's earnings on Thursday, and based on Netflix last week with that huge reduction in subscribers, it's thought that the Twitter numbers could be really quite bad. So for all of those reasons, the board jumped at the opportunity to sell to Elon Musk. What are the changes going to be? Well, we don't know much about it, but we think it's going to be a more fun place. We think there's going to be less moderation. It's this free speech thing and where the politics comes in, because if there's less moderation, then that means that people will be able to say a lot. And it basically opens the door for Donald Trump. And so the left doesn't like that very much. We also think that there's going to be less spam. He's going to have to make money, of course, so that means more advertising. They're going to have to step up their game when it comes to that. He has tweeted, "I hope my critics won't exit." The critics are saying, "Look, mate, you're not very transparent when it comes to Tesla. Why do you think you're going to be any different when it comes to Twitter?" Which is a fair point. And the staff at Twitter are very worried after he tweeted about turning their headquarters into a homeless shelter. I think they think there could be quite a lot of redundancies there, particularly in the moderation of free speech area. But that's the politics side. The business side, a tremendous achievement. And Twitter shares are down a little bit now, about 3% at the moment, I think.
We shall no doubt return to Twitter tomorrow in the coming days, John. I want to ask you about Morgan Stanley, which has a bear market warning.
Yeah, well, Morgan Stanley, of course, is one of the two banks, and I'm sure there are others as well that I don't know about, who helped Elon Musk to buy Twitter. And Morgan Stanley is saying to its customers who buy and sell stock, basically, that it thinks that there is a bear market coming in US stocks. And they say two things. One is that there's nowhere to hide at the moment. And the second thing, which is more relevant, is that they say there's no rotation that is obvious. Now, what that means is normally when professional investors are looking at an area, once it gets to the end of its run, then they simply swap to another area. And what Morgan Stanley is saying is that the rotation, as it's called, is not particularly obvious at the moment. So normally you're going maybe for growth stocks, like the technology stocks, and when they come to the end of their run, you switch over to value stocks. And it doesn't seem to Morgan Stanley to be too obvious. They say the S&P 500 could hit bearish territory. That's 20% down on its all-time high. On the other hand, I have to say, other people on Wall Street think the complete opposite. So you just never know. I will tell you at the moment, the markets here are all down about 2 to 3% because of concerns about global downturn for various reasons, not least of all what's going on in China at the moment regarding COVID. Guys?
John, we'll see you tomorrow. All the best. Thanks so much for that. Our correspondent, John Terrace, in New York.
The UK is hosting a second round of trade talks with the United States. Deals on steel imports were reached after the first round in the US earlier this year. The British Chambers of Commerce and union leaders are joining the talks in London after the trade secretaries met in Scotland on Monday. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson reports.
Touring an oil exploration company in Scotland is a second chance for the trade secretaries to display warming relations in public. This two-day meeting is another step towards gradually reshaping a trade relationship post-Trump on one side and post-Brexit on the other. So far, the Americans have lifted tariffs on British steel and aluminium in exchange for freer flow of some US goods into the UK. And a truce has been declared between aircraft giants Boeing and Airbus.
And our collaboration continues. So these are very proper trade talks. We are talking about trade. And really the purpose of these engagements is to further explore the synergies between our economies and our approaches to trade. We share so much in terms of values.
This is the second meeting. The same parties met in the US port of Baltimore in March, where again warm words were exchanged.
Our special relationship is not just defined by a shared history, but most importantly by our shared values.
But of deep concern to the Americans is the Northern Ireland Protocol, a Brexit agreement meaning there are no new checks on goods crossing the border between Northern Ireland, part of the UK, and Ireland, an EU member. The White House doesn't like reports of Westminster threatening to unilaterally pull out if Brussels and London can't find a way forward. It could be a deal breaker.
The Ambassador and I have discussed this at some length, and indeed I have with many other members of Congress, is that we are all committed to the Good Friday Agreement remaining absolutely solid, and that's in very large part about trade.
The White House also wants special accounting measures for UK companies under foreign ownership, particularly steel production. Similar measures have already been agreed with the EU and Japan. Washington may be pressing the reset button with London, but while some US goods might start flowing more easily, the overriding atmosphere is still one of caution. Andrew Wilson, CGTN.
European stock markets are ending the day rather lower after suffering sharp falls in the previous session, driven by fears about lockdowns in China, inflation and higher interest rates. Our business correspondent Juliet Mann has the story. Juliet.
Thanks, Jamie and Robin. Well, central banks' decisions on interest rates as well as geopolitics continue to be what's mostly driving markets. But better than expected numbers from top-line companies put investors in a positive mood. In Europe's banking sector, HSBC, Europe's largest bank, posted a pre-tax profit of $4.2 billion for the first quarter. Now, that was better than expected, but still a 27% drop from a year ago. UBS fared better, posting a 17% rise in first quarter net profit to $2.14 billion. And earnings at Banco Santander, that's Spain's biggest bank, they were buoyed by lending in Europe. Net income beat expectations in the first quarter. But there are a couple of big names proving a drag on the markets. And a couple I've pulled out for you. Associated British Foods. Now, they are the company that own clothing chain Primark. They reported first half revenue up 25% to $10 billion. But they warned about inflation and said the clothing chain will have to raise prices as it's no longer able to offset cost increases with savings. And their food businesses, which include brands like Twinings, Kingsmill, Ryvita, all the kind of things you find in Robin's Locker, face more inflationary pressure from raw materials, commodities, energy and supply chain costs made worse by the war in Ukraine. And the other one that's interesting today, London's Heathrow Airport. Now, they reported adjusted core earnings of $348 million for the first quarter. And while they won't make a profit in 2022, since COVID-19 losses topped $5 billion, it did raise its 2022 forecast for passengers to 52.8 billion people. That's around two-thirds of pre-pandemic levels. That's driven by demand for leisure travel. But the UK's biggest airport says it expects numbers to drop off significantly after the summer. Well, Paul Charles is the CEO of travel PR firm PC Agency.
It's certainly a turbulent time, but then the travel industry has seen turbulent times before. We had the ash cloud, obviously, over 10 years ago in Europe, which led to pretty well 10 days of closures across European airspace. We've obviously seen recessions before, which have hurt airlines and airports. And now, of course, we're coming out of COVID. And I think the challenges for the industry overall seem to be greater than those for bosses during COVID itself, and they're finding it particularly difficult to get their operations back in order.
If we look at the Heathrow results, that passenger numbers are predicted higher, but Heathrow's boss says it's a bubble that won't last beyond summer. Do you agree?
Well, I think Heathrow is being unusually pessimistic, and that's possibly because it's battling with the airlines at the moment over its charging structure and with the regulators over the amount it can charge per passenger fee in future. And we're not seeing the same pessimism from the airlines or from other airports. It is very surprising to see Heathrow being in this position. They're going to have a really good run up to the summer. They're going to have a great summer itself. And if confidence can stay high, then I think you're still going to see a really good winter. So I'd be more optimistic, actually, about where things are heading. The pent-up demand is there among consumers, and I'm not seeing it change at all across the travel industry.
It's been tough for many airlines, though, and I'm thinking British Airways, who are scrapping routes to some major destinations like Miami, like Tokyo, for the entire summer. What's going on?
British Airways, like many airlines, is finding it difficult to get enough staff. They're finding the staff shortages are really weighing them down. That's partly because of the government not processing security clearance, not vetting fast enough. Traditionally, it would take about 4 weeks to get a security pass for somebody working in the industry, especially as cabin crew. But at the moment, it's taking between 12 and 16 weeks, sometimes longer. And so that's slowing down the amount of hiring that can take place in the airline industry. So BA, like other airlines, is having to cut back simply because they can't service every single flight they wish to. So the demand is there to fly to Miami and other places, but they simply can't service it. And that's why they're having to reduce the frequency, especially in destinations where they fly more than once a day anyway, so they can bunch up those planes into one.
I want to talk about those landing fees that Heathrow are increasing to offset some of those losses from the pandemic. The airlines aren't happy about it. Passengers won't be happy about it if the costs get passed on to them. But what else is there for airports and airlines to do to claw back some of the losses when they're being hampered by slow governments, as you're mentioning, in terms of authorising new staff?
It's a really good question, because airlines obviously are having to look for extra revenues where they can, not just through raising passenger charges, but also by charging for other things, such as drop-offs now. When you drop somebody off in your car at the airport, you can be charged for that upwards of £5 or £10. And many airports are looking at those alternative charges, trying to claw back as much as they can. Don't forget, they're also facing higher costs from energy bills, higher energy costs, and heating their own terminals, for example. So they're desperately trying to look for ways to claw back the losses that they've made over the last few years. Heathrow is in a worse position. It's bigger, it's trying to charge more to the airlines, who themselves are looking at other airports to be able to land at in the future. And they're starting to think, well, do we need Heathrow, or can we go somewhere else? But don't forget, Heathrow is in a really strong position. It is the hub airport in the UK, and a lot of airlines like the fact that passengers can seamlessly transit from one service to another. So don't rule out Heathrow. They will become profitable again. You can bet your bottom dollar on it.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin holds talks with more than 40 countries in Germany. In a major U-turn, Berlin signs off sending tanks for Ukraine.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Frank talks in Moscow over the war in Ukraine as the United Nations Secretary-General calls for a ceasefire as soon as possible.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Will Denslow in Riga. Will, what exactly have Lavrov and Guterres said?
Well, the message from Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary-General, is that he came as a messenger for peace. He said he was hoping to save lives and reduce suffering. He also said that his meeting with Sergei Lavrov was a frank discussion. He said that he did not subscribe to Russia's version of events on the ground in Ukraine, reiterating what he said for the last few months at UN headquarters in New York, believing that Russia had invaded Ukraine and it was a violation of the UN Charter. He also says that he wants to see investigations into allegations of potential war crimes being committed. Despite those strong comments, though, Antonio Guterres said he hoped that more could be done when it came to helping to install humanitarian corridors, to see localised cessation of hostilities, as well as allowing more aid into the country. The message from the Secretary-General, he said that the most pressing need was to see a humanitarian corridor out of the besieged city of Mariupol in Ukraine. Let's have a listen.
My proposal is for a coordinated work of the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Ukraine and Russian Federation forces to enable the safe evacuation of those civilians who want to leave, both inside the Azovstal plan and in the city, in any direction they choose, and to deliver the humanitarian aid required.
And Will, what exactly is Russia's position?
Well, the message from Sergei Lavrov is that a strong rejection of some of the convictions from the Secretary-General, stating that they are willing to continue with negotiations with Ukraine in good faith. Of course, that's something that the UN has been trying to do over recent weeks. The UN aid chief, Martin Griffiths, has been trying to get conversations going with Ukraine and with Russia to try and get a humanitarian ceasefire in effect. Of course, that has so far been unsuccessful. Lavrov says that it is Western powers and Ukraine that are really hampering that progress and not the actions of Russia. And Sergei Lavrov also once again very much cast the shadow of blame on Kiev, stating that they're the ones responsible for essentially the Minsk agreement breaking down several years ago.
The Security Council resolution should also be sacred for the Secretary, especially the consensus resolution, when all 15 members vote for a specific solution. And it was through this consensus that in February 2015 the Minsk Accord was approved. This paper clearly states that there was a need for dialogue between Kiev, Donetsk and Luhansk in order to settle all issues within the framework of territorial integrity.
And despite those disagreements between Lavrov and Antonio Guterres, the Russian foreign minister did, however, say that he was looking to continue to try and cooperate with the United Nations to try and get humanitarian aid into parts of Ukraine going forward.
Will, thanks for that. Will Denslow, our correspondent in Riga.
US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is holding talks with more than 40 countries at a US airbase in Germany. They're discussing providing more weapons and aid to Ukraine. Ahead of the talks, Austin said Ukraine could win the war against Russia. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Natalie Carney in Munich. Natalie, what's come out of this conference?
Well, the meeting has just wrapped up, and the goal of the meeting, according to Lloyd Austin, was to leave with a common, transparent understanding of Ukraine's short-term and long-term security requirements, and that is pretty much what came out of today's conference. He did applaud and say good job, essentially, to Germany after they announced that they would finally deliver their first shipment of heavy weaponry to Ukraine. 50 Gepard anti-aircraft systems. This, of course, comes after the UK announced just yesterday that it, too, would provide further anti-aircraft capabilities. As well, Canada also today made a pledge to send Ukraine 8 armored... Sorry, did applaud all countries who are stepping up to meet Ukraine's demands in a timely fashion. Here's a little more of what he had to say.
But we don't have any time to waste. The briefings today laid out clearly why the coming weeks will be so crucial for Ukraine. So we've got to move at the speed of war. And I know that all the leaders leave today more resolved than ever to support Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression and atrocities.
This conference is now going to be extended, according to the Defense Secretary, and become a monthly checkup between all good-willed countries, saying that it will be a vehicle for these nations to intensify our efforts and coordinate our assistance and focus on winning today's fight and the struggles to come.
So, Natalie, we've had this announcement from Germany that it's going to send heavy weaponry and tanks to Ukraine. How significant is it?
It is rather significant, considering for the last little while, Germany has really been, you could say, criticized and pressured by its international allies for not making the move yet to send heavy weaponry. The Chancellor Olaf Scholz has used the argument that it would simply take too long to train Ukrainian soldiers on this new technology, as well that it would then limit Germany's capabilities and Germany's obligations to both national and NATO. As well, it would also could potentially provoke Vladimir Putin. So these have been the arguments that the government here has put forward in their hesitation and their rather cautious approach to sending weapons to Ukraine, despite the president of Ukraine asking for them repeatedly. But today the announcement has been made that approach seems to have been changed. And according to the German Defense Minister, Christian Lambrecht, this is a clear break with Berlin's cautious policy and exactly what the Ukraine needs now.
Natalie Carney in Munich, thank you.
Louise Jones is head of intelligence at McKinsey Intelligence Services. She gave us her assessment of the conflict in Ukraine so far.
I think it's pretty clear that Russia has failed to achieve its really key strategic aims. At the beginning, it was very ambitious. You know, it had ambitious that it would be able to take Kiev, it would be able to install a government in Kiev that was considerably friendlier towards Russia. You know, those ambitions now lie in ruins. So they've really had to alter what their key objectives are. I think recent announcements have shown that they are now concentrating on being able to consolidate what they've already gained, looking down in the southeast, looking at Mariupol. And they've even suggested that they might be interested in trying to take Odessa. So this is slightly further west than they've been able to go previously. Now, Ukraine itself, President Zelensky has been very adamant that he wants to recover, every inch of Ukrainian soil. He's been very adamant about that. I think in the short-term objectives, Ukraine will be looking to reinforce some of the limited successes it's had in driving east, just to the south of Kharkiv in the north. I think if Ukraine gets to direct where this battle goes now, we'll see the majority of their focus be trying to cut off those Russians in the north around Kharkiv to those that are around Mariupol and Donetsk in the south.
Germany has announced that it's going to be sending heavy weaponry to Ukraine. Your analysis on the significance of that, is this going to alter the course of the fighting, or is it simply about optics?
So I think it's interesting. There's two things that are equally important. Optics do matter in this kind of conflict. I think this is a really strong signal that Germany, which has been reluctant to really take very decisive action, this is them really starting to get involved, and that is a big sea change in the environment for Russia. So, that in itself is very important. The delivery of the equipment itself, so they are delivering some air defense equipment. Now, this won't arrive for, several weeks at least, and there is a large training burden that the Ukrainians will need to undergo. They won't just be able to start using this kit. It is a bit more complicated when you're starting to use air defense equipment. So I would say in the short term, there will be no real difference on the battlefield, but really it's that shift and what it says about the shift in Germany's interest in this conflict at the moment strategically.
Can we look ahead now, perhaps weeks and even months, and perhaps what you think we should be prepared for in the coming weeks and months ahead?
So we should be prepared to see this conflict continue. It could easily go on for months. It could easily go on for even longer. So there just needs to be an understanding that support to Ukraine, those countries that are supporting Ukraine are going to have to keep this support up for a long time. possibly past, populations currently are very sympathetic towards Ukraine. Supporting Ukraine is very popular. But as the months go by, this may start to wane slightly. And then on the Russian side, again, this will go on far longer than they had anticipated, far longer than they were prepared for. And we risk really that the pace of the conflict really slows down, no side really making any gains or any movements, and it risks becoming a frozen conflict, which of course is just going to cause more harm and more damage to the people of Ukraine.
A migrant has died and 26 are missing after their dinghy capsized near the Canary Islands. 34 other people were rescued by the Spanish Coast Guard. Another 2 boats carrying around 63 people were also found. They're thought to have sailed from Western Sahara.
3 Chinese nationals have been killed after a van they were travelling in was blown up in the Pakistani city of Karachi. A Pakistani national was also killed. The Baloch Liberation Army separatist group has claimed responsibility. Pakistan's new Prime Minister has condemned the attack.
Sri Lanka must tighten monetary policy and raise taxes to overcome its debt crisis. That's according to the International Monetary Fund. The country is suffering its worst economic crisis in decades, triggering protests with its president under pressure to resign. The government has requested loans from the IMF as it struggles to pay for food, fuel and medicine.
DPRK leader Kim Jong-un has vowed to build up his country's nuclear arsenal at the fastest pace. He made those comments at a vast nighttime military parade showcasing the DPRK's tanks, rocket launchers and intercontinental ballistic missiles. The parade was held to mark the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Korean People's Revolutionary Army.
Emmanuel Macron has a fight on his hands as he begins his second term as French president. He has a cabinet to appoint, controversial reforms to enact, and a pledge to unite a divided country ahead of parliamentary elections in June that some are calling a third-round runoff. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Ryan Thompson, who's in Paris. So, Ryan, what's first on Emmanuel Macron's to-do list?
Hi, Robin. Well, Emmanuel Macron is back to work at the Elysee Palace after taking Monday working from a remote secondary residence just outside of Paris. But he's got quite a lot on his to-do list. Item number 1 is to reshuffle the government because, as he laid out during campaign season, there is a lot to do, notably trying to reach a number of climate goals, provide a cost of living bonus to French workers across the country, and attempt pension reform for a second time, something that failed during his first term. Now, to do this, he will need a government that is prepared to work for him. And so, excuse me, he's preparing to put a number of ministers and reshuffle the cabinet, notably with some of them staying on, some of them being told to leave. And then, Robin, there is the question of the prime minister, because Jean Castex, the man who has been in charge since we exited lockdown here in France, is going to resign. And there are 2 names being floated for head of government. One coming from the agriculture minister, another coming from the Ministry for Labor. Now, there is also a second question on top of that, because even if a new prime minister is named, well, it might have to be reshuffled further when legislative elections come around in June, and there may be a shift of power within the 2 houses of parliament here in France.
So, Ryan, you mentioned those parliamentary elections coming up in June. How big a challenge will they be for Macron, and how might they affect his second term?
Well, in order to achieve all of the policy priorities he's laid out during campaign season, Emmanuel Macron will need to take idea to legislation to actually implement it into law. But doing that will be a bit difficult if he doesn't have the support within the 2 houses of parliament that he's had for the past 5 years, because since Emmanuel Macron has come to office in that 2017 election, he's also seen his party, La République en Marche, the Republic on the Move, has had a majority in the 2 houses of parliament. So it's been quite seamless to go from idea to piece of legislation. Now it is looking increasingly like voters want to not have them hold the majority in the 2 houses of parliament. Increasingly, a majority of French people want to see a cohabitating government, which would mean that Emmanuel Macron and his party would hold the Elysee or the executive branch, but there would be a different holder of the keys to the parliament and the Senate. That could make passing bills and legislation and policy priorities quite difficult. It increasingly also is looking like that these parties within the parliament are going to form coalitions, and they could potentially be leaning extremely to the left or extremely to the right. So Emmanuel Macron ultimately has his work cut out for him as he approaches the next few weeks.
OK, Ryan Thompson in Paris, thank you very much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, why the cost of living crisis could be the deciding issue for UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the forthcoming local elections.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated. Is the front line now after 9 days of fighting?
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe.
The cost of food in the UK has gone up 6% in the past 12 months and is set to continue rising. Research firm Kantar says average grocery bills will increase by hundreds of dollars this year. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has summoned his cabinet to try and find solutions. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Naweed Jabarkal. Naweed, what has the government been discussing?
Well, this really is a change in tack from Boris Johnson, aware that there are local elections coming up on the 5th of May. He wants to try and focus on the cost of living crisis here in the UK, admitting that this is a real issue that's hurting people up and down the country. Inflation is at 7%, more than 30 years since it was that high. Supply chain issues, partly around Brexit, made worse by Brexit. The war in Ukraine also having an impact, particularly around oil and gas and energy prices. That new report says the average household here in the UK will see their food bills rise by $350 approximately each year. So even more concern added to what is a pressurised situation for many families. We spoke yesterday about how 9 in 10 said that they were worried about their bills going up. Now, in terms of the levers, the government has taxation's an obvious one, but that's already been done. This government, if you look at the last 6 or 7 governments that have governed here in the UK, none has raised taxes more than Boris Johnson's. As of this month, a 1.25% national insurance hike has been brought in as well for millions across the country. Aware of that, he's now asked his colleagues to come up with innovative ideas, he's calling them, to try and save money within the budget that's already been produced. He's going to chair a special committee looking into this in the coming weeks. Downing Street says that will be in the next few weeks, that will be set up. But this really is an admission, I think, from Downing Street that this is something that could hurt them politically moving forward, particularly with those elections around the corner.
As you say, local elections just around the corner, and the opposition, the Labour Party, really is seeing a big opportunity here.
Definitely, and Keir Starmer, what he's been saying, he's the leader of the opposition, main opposition Labour Party. He says what they need is, quote, an emergency budget, not just a cabinet meeting. He wants to see more action coming out to the Chancellor at number 11 Downing Street, and in particular more targeted help for poorer families. Those elections will be a good barometer of just what ordinary voters make up and down the country. But I think for Keir Starmer, he's being urged by voters as well as the Labour Party to not be so wooden and to try and emerge as more of a leader, really, and not seem as out of touch. He was a lawyer. A lot of his focus recently has been on Partygate and what's been happening within Downing Street. What the messaging around him we're hearing is that he needs to start talking about issues that really matter to people. And this is really, I'd struggle to remember a time when a government's been as weak, or when the issues surrounding ordinary people and the troubles they're facing have been as apparent with this cost of living crisis. And one key thing that we are hearing from the Labour Party is energy bills. They want to try and reduce that by targeting companies and oil and gas producers with a windfall tax in the North Sea.
So are you saying that the UK is no longer talking about Partygate? That's gone away, has it?
Well, I don't think that's going to necessarily be the issue, but if you look at what's happening with the 5th of May, particularly around the north of England, places like that, this is an opportunity for opposition parties to really highlight that under 10, 11, 12 years now of Conservative Party leadership in this country, a lot of them are being worse off, and we've heard reports of the Labour Party putting leaflets through saying this is how much taxation the Conservatives have brought in. Traditionally a party that's meant to be cutting taxes. That's what makes this so interesting. But it must be said the global environment is very unique at the moment, as we've been reporting in the show. The war in Ukraine, lots of other pressures really making it hard to govern at the moment. But I think we're going to see from Keir Starmer in the next few weeks, also for him, if the local elections, if the Labour Party doesn't cut through, then it could mean trouble, not just for Boris Johnson, but for Keir Starmer as well.
Interesting.
Thank you, Nareed.
Nareed, thank you. Beijing is expanding its mass testing to 20 million people in a bid to try and contain its latest coronavirus outbreak. The Chinese capital is trying to avoid a citywide lockdown like Shanghai's. Meanwhile, China's drug regulator has approved clinical trials of a Sinopharm vaccine, which is specifically designed for the Omicron variant. Our correspondent Yang Shanshan reports.
Beijing found 21 confirmed patients, as well as one positive case without symptoms since 4 o'clock yesterday. They have already been isolated for treatment, and the areas where they live are locked down. Actually, Chinese experts say many patients in Beijing got the virus from a house decoration team, a wedding banquet, a tourist group, and a school gathering. Actually, the lockdown indeed sparked fears of food shortage, and many people just rushed to the supermarkets for panic buying these days. And in response, Beijing government has adopted measures to guarantee all the supply and the logistics of daily goods. Many supermarkets just increased the stocks and even delayed their closure time these days to satisfy the demand of customers. E-commerce also increased the stocks like meat, vegetable, fruits to ensure delivery service. Government also vows to crack down illegal trading to stabilize food prices. Some communities who have discovered COVID patients or have close contacts of COVID patients have imposed restriction rules to curb spread of virus now. Residents there are not allowed to leave the restriction area. However, government delivered food bags to residents under isolation rule. And for the rest, the people can make online orders through the delivery service or buy essential food within the restriction area. Well, the supermarkets are actually still open within the restriction area. And for those who need medical care, community worker would help them to have access to hospital.
Yang Shanshan reporting from Beijing. South Korea is seeing a huge increase in the price of cars, which has been called carflation. Trouble began when COVID-19 sparked a semiconductor shortage, but it's now being made worse by Russia's attack on Ukraine. Our correspondent Jack Barton reports from Seoul.
This is one of the biggest used car lots in the South Korean capital, Seoul. Here, there's no point writing prices on windscreens because they'll probably rise tomorrow.
Compared to the pre-pandemic period, new cars prices have increased by 10% and used cars 15%. Right now, the price of all vehicles is skyrocketing to the point where the word carflation, combining car and inflation, has come into being.
While the pandemic played its part in carflation, the big concern is now the conflict in Ukraine.
Due to the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, the price of oil has soared and the cost of raw materials and logistics has increased greatly.
Modern cars are dependent on semiconductors, which are dependent on lasers to cut them, which in turn are dependent on high-grade neon gases, roughly half of which are made by just 2 companies in Ukraine, one of them in the largely devastated town of Mariupol. New cars also require many rare earth materials supplied by Russia for batteries, pollution-reducing catalytic converters and, of course, semiconductors.
Before people can count on well, if the semiconductor is not available now, it'll be available eventually. But now that period of being available eventually has been put backwards because a lot of these crucial elements are no longer going to be available for an extended period of time.
The only potential good news regarding chip prices and car availability is, unfortunately, also bad news.
Global growth is expected to go down. That may reduce the demand in some of the countries whose automobile demand went up. And the rising interest rates led by the United States will probably be followed by most of the advanced countries. That may also reduce the demand for automobiles, which may reduce the so-called carflation.
With no reduction in carflation on the immediate horizon, many Korean motorists are hanging on to their old cars, leading to a not unwelcome boom in the auto repair sector. Jack Barton, CGTN, Seoul.
The Venice Biennale is underway for the first time in 3 years. It's one of the most important events in the international arts calendar, but it's been paused since 2019 because of the pandemic.
More than 200 artists from 80 countries are taking part. Our correspondent Hermione Kitson reports.
The Venice Biennale has a star artist like never before, an ultra-realistic humanoid robot.
How do you feel to be making history by participating in the Venice Biennale this year?
I have to say that Venice is a very special place to me. I want to show my work.
Ada is blurring the lines between art and artificial intelligence. Cameras in her eyes capture vision that's processed by AI algorithms into coordinates, which are then converted into sketches with her bionic arm. Each work is unique.
Actually, the way that the algorithms are put together now, we are fundamentally looking at creativity.
Ada was completed in 2019 in Oxford, England, and has since travelled the world. Her creator says the exhibition, Leaping into the Metaverse, aims to raise ethical questions about the role of technology in our lives today, while using ideas from Italy's 13th century poet, Dante.
Technology is very powerful. But we've set this in the world of Dante in Purgatoria. And the reason we've done that is because we don't know whether it's heaven or hell.
More than 200 artists are gathered in Venice for the event's post-pandemic return.
80 nations are represented in different pavilions across the Biennale, and while organisers say the event was curated during the pandemic, it also reflects the world's current state of emergency.
The Russian Biennale team resigned at the war's outset, but the Ukrainian pavilion is open. Lizaveta German is among the curators. She fled Kiev just days before her baby was born.
Our mission is maybe to spread the word, to spread the information, to spread the knowledge about this brutal war that is happening now in Ukraine. And we realize that the cultural frontier is also the frontier.
The Fountain of Exhaustion by artist Pavlo Markov was conceived in the city of Kharkiv in the mid-90s and communicates a message of resilience.
I was in Kiev, so I put the funnels from the fountain in the trunk of my car and just started, my journey. Exhaustion is here with the war, and that was a kind of alert from Pavlo many years ago.
A Biennale of art representing past, present and future battles. The event will run until the end of November. Hermione Kitson, CGTN, Venice.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Preview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. All of the team here in London, goodbye.
Bye.